The documents were meticulous, signed in blue ink, witnessed by no one, stored in a folder labeled Personal Agreements on his laptop. Each contract was nearly identical a gift agreement, carefully worded to establish that the money transferred was a voluntary gift, binding and irrevocable, meant to provide security for someone he loved. The language was almost tender. I, the undersigned, hereby gift the sum of, followed by numbers that seemed reasonable at the time. 20,000, 50,000, 75,000, not all at once. Over months, over years. The kind of spending that feels protective rather than depleting, because each transfer was attached to a story. Help with rent, medical expenses, a business opportunity, a family emergency. The contracts existed in a space between romance and legality, between gift and obligation. They were signed willingly. They were signed by him, and they were absolutely binding. What no one knew, what he didn't know, was that 4 different men across 4 different cities had signed nearly identical agreements. That the same woman who had told him she was rebuilding her life after a difficult divorce had told another man the same story, with different details but identical emotional architecture. That the softness he'd experienced as vulnerability was actually precision. That the need he'd felt called to fulfill was the need she'd deliberately constructed in him. Her name was Mary Martin. She was 34 years old. She had never been divorced. She had built a life on the careful curation of other people's desires to be essential, and she had weaponized their generosity with the cold efficiency of someone who understood that the law protects contracts more reliably than it protects hearts. This is the story of how someone convinces 4 millionaires that protecting her is their idea. This is the story of how softness can be a strategy. This is the story of Mary Martin, and what her rise and fall reveals about the gap between who we pretend to be and who we actually are, and why even the wealthy, even the successful, even the intelligent, are vulnerable to someone who understands what they need to believe about themselves. The contracts would eventually be discovered. The consistency would eventually become visible. The pattern would eventually break. But before that happened, before the exposure and the connections and the slow realization that 4 separate lives had been touched by the same deception, there was something else. The question of whether Mary Martin ever truly believed her own story. Whether the person she'd become, the one who extracted money with such precision, was who she actually was. Or whether she too was living inside a lie so complete that the line between survival and predation had become invisible. That question is where we begin. Mary Martin was born in Portland, Oregon, to a mother who worked 3 jobs and a father who left when she was 7. What remains from that childhood isn't trauma in the dramatic sense. No abuse, no neglect, so severe it required intervention. What remains is something quieter and more persistent, the understanding that safety is conditional. That love is work. That the people who are supposed to protect you might not be able to afford to. Her mother was exhausted, perpetually broke, and deeply ashamed of both facts. She taught Mary, without words, that dependency was something to hide, that needing help was a personal failure, that the only reliable protection was the kind you could construct yourself. By age 16, Mary had learned to read the gaps in people. She understood instinctively that wealthy men with money, but without constant companionship, were experiencing a specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from them. She noticed that these men responded to softness. Not weakness, exactly, but the carefully calibrated presentation of vulnerability that suggested they could fix something, that they could matter, that their money, which often felt isolating, could actually mean something. She was not deliberately manipulative at first. In her early 20s, when she met the first man who would eventually sign a contract, she was simply surviving. She was working retail, living in a shared apartment, trying to afford the life she'd seen other people have without understanding the actual machinery of how they got there. When David, a successful real estate developer 15 years her senior, began asking about her life, she told him the truth, but she told it a certain way. She emphasized the struggle. She downplayed her own resilience. She positioned herself as someone who needed exactly what he could provide: stability, security, the feeling of being taken care of. The first gift wasn't framed as a gift. It was presented as help. He offered to pay her rent for a few months while she got back on her feet. She accepted with gratitude. It was both genuine and performed. She needed the money. She also needed him to feel that providing it had been meaningful. Those two needs weren't contradictory. They were symbiotic. What transformed over time wasn't her intention. It was her awareness. She began to understand that the emotional architecture she'd stumbled into could be replicated, that the specific sequence of vulnerability, gratitude, and deepening dependency that had worked with David could work with others. She wasn't conscious of it as strategy initially. It felt more like finding a language she already spoke fluently, the language of someone who had learned early, that her survival depended on understanding what other people needed to believe about themselves. By her late 20s, Mary had become something. Not quite a con artist, because that word suggests a deliberate criminal intent that she couldn't quite locate within herself. She had never planned to deceive anyone. She had simply found that deception worked. And once something works, especially when you've spent your entire life scrounging for anything that does, you tend to keep doing it. The contracts came later, after the second relationship, when she realized that verbal agreements, promises of repayment, acknowledgments of debt were too fragile. Written contracts, she discovered, had weight. They created the illusion of legality and protection. They made the extraction of money feel less like theft and more like a transaction between consenting adults. She began drafting them herself, using language she'd researched online, creating documents that appeared to be legally binding gifts while actually establishing claims that would be extraordinarily difficult to challenge. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't need to be. She needed the contracts to look official enough that the men who signed them didn't scrutinize them too carefully. And they didn't, because scrutinizing a gift agreement, really examining its terms, really considering its implications, would have required acknowledging that something about the relationship wasn't what they'd told themselves it was. The psychology of gift agreements is peculiar. Once you've signed one, you've already made a declaration that the money is a gift, freely given, without expectation of return. To later claim you were deceived is to admit you were duped. It's to acknowledge that your judgment was flawed, that your understanding of the relationship was wrong, that the person you believed you were helping was actually playing you. Most people, faced with that choice, prefer to stay silent. They prefer to accept the loss rather than expose themselves to the shame of having been chosen as a target. Mary understood this, though she couldn't have articulated in these terms. What she understood was that people protect themselves through silence. That shame is a more powerful silencer than fear. That a man who has signed a contract giving away his money is unlikely to tell anyone, because telling anyone means admitting he was fooled. And men like the ones she targeted, successful, intelligent, used to being the ones doing the choosing, have particularly fragile relationships with the idea that they could be foolish. So she continued, not with cruelty, but with consistency, not with violence, but with the slow, patient extraction of resources from men who believed they were protecting her. She told each one a version of her story that was true enough to be believable. She positioned herself as someone who had experienced setbacks, a failed business, a difficult family situation, a series of bad decisions that had left her without safety net. She allowed them to rescue her. And when the rescue had been formalized in a contract, she moved on. By age 34, Mary Martin had constructed a life that was, by external measures, successful. She had money. She had mobility. She had the freedom that comes from not being dependent on a single income source. What she didn't have, and what she'd stopped looking for, was the thing that had driven her to this in the first place, the feeling of actual safety, real security, the kind that comes from being genuinely cared for rather than strategically chosen. She had optimized her survival so completely that she'd lost the ability to imagine what living without optimization might feel like. This is the architecture she built. Not in a day, not in a year, but over a decade of small decisions that each felt reasonable at the time. A series of choices that, when lined up, created a pattern so clear that it would eventually be undeniable. But before that clarity came, There was only the continuation of the system that worked. There was only the next man, the next contract, the next version of a story she'd learned to tell so well that she'd started to believe parts of it herself. David Chun didn't think of himself as lonely. He thought of himself as selective. At 52, he'd built a commercial real estate empire across the Pacific Northwest. He attended galas. He had friends who were important people. He belonged to clubs. But selection, he was beginning to understand, was another word for isolation. The people around him wanted access to his network, or his money, or his influence. The relationships were transactional in ways that had become invisible through repetition. He didn't notice the transactionality anymore. He'd simply accepted it as the texture of his life. When Mary entered his world, or more accurately, when he entered hers, pulling her into a coffee shop where she worked part-time, she presented a different kind of transaction, one that felt less like business and more like rescue. She was struggling. She was intelligent. She was grateful. These qualities activated something in him that had atrophied from disuse, the feeling of being needed for something other than money, of mattering in a way that wasn't reducible to his net worth. He began paying her rent. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, a bridge to help her find steadier employment. But steady employment, it turned out, was complicated. There were barriers he hadn't anticipated. Childcare costs, medical bills from a family emergency, a car that broke down. Each obstacle was real. Each one was also an opportunity for him to continue mattering, to continue being the person she turned when the world became too expensive to survive in alone. What David didn't understand, what wealthy people often don't understand, is that their isolation creates a specific vulnerability. He had money, yes, but he lacked something that people with less money often possess: regular, consistent exposure to the idea that other people are struggling. He encountered struggle primarily through Mary, which meant her struggle became, in his mind, representative of struggle itself. Her problems became important in a way that made solving them feel urgent. Her gratitude became, in a strange way, confirmation of his own worth. The first contract appeared 8 months into their relationship. Mary had received an unexpected bill, a legal judgment from a previous debt. She was devastated. She asked David if he could help. He said yes, without hesitation. But Mary, who was becoming more thoughtful about documentation, suggested they formalize it. "I don't want you to ever feel like I'm taking advantage," she said. "I want it to be clear that this is a gift. I want you to have that protection." The language was elegant. It positioned the contract as his protection, not hers. It made the documentation feel like an act of care rather than extraction. David signed without really reading it. That detail matters, not because it excuses what happened, but because it reveals something true about how people who have been successful in one domain, like business, often become careless in others. He skimmed the document, saw that it formalized the money as a gift, and signed. The idea that someone he cared for would weaponize a contract against him didn't even occur to him as a possibility worth considering. What's crucial to understand is that Mary didn't target David randomly. She targeted him because she'd learned to recognize a very specific profile, a man with substantial wealth but limited emotional connections. A man who had built his life around achievement and had, in the process, constructed a version of himself that was successful but isolated. A man who was vulnerable to someone who could make him feel necessary while simultaneously understanding, at a cellular level, that he would likely never know the full truth of who she was. This is what wealth conceals, the reality of dependency. David had spent his life believing that money insulated him, that it protected him, that it gave him control. In most domains, this was true. In his professional life, money did equal power. But in the domain of human connection, money is precisely the thing that makes you vulnerable to someone willing to use it as a tool. Someone who understands that a wealthy man's greatest fear isn't losing money. He has enough that individual sums feel manageable. His greatest fear is losing relevance, losing the feeling that he matters, losing the evidence that his success translates into anything meaningful beyond quarterly earnings reports. Mary understood this. She understood that David didn't actually need her to need his money. He needed to believe that his willingness to provide it made a difference in her life, that without him, her life would be materially worse. She crafted a narrative in which this was true, and she did it so skillfully that David believed it. And believing it, he continued to give, continued to sign documents, continued to tell himself a story about why he was doing it that positioned him as good rather than foolish. Over 3 years, David gave Mary approximately $420,000. The amount increased gradually. Each transfer was slightly larger than the last. Each time, there was a reason. Each time, the reason was real enough to be believable. A business opportunity that didn't pan out. A family situation that required unexpected support. Medical expenses that insurance didn't cover. The reasons didn't need to be entirely true. They just needed to be plausible enough that David's desire to believe them could overcome his skepticism. What's interesting about David's story, and what distinguishes it from simple financial fraud, is that at no point did Mary explicitly lie to him about wanting his money. She never said, "I need you to support me." She said things like, "I'm trying so hard to get on my feet, and I keep running into obstacles." She said things like, "I don't know what I'd do without your help." Both statements were true, in a way. She was, in fact, trying. She was, in fact, relying on his help. What she didn't say, and what David didn't ask, was whether she was simultaneously constructing the same situation with other men. When David eventually discovered the truth, not through Mary's confession, but through a chance meeting with another man who mentioned a woman named Mary in a context that didn't quite fit, he experienced something that he would later describe as worse than the financial loss. He experienced the recognition that he'd been selected. At every tender moment, every instance of her vulnerability, every time she'd cried in his arms about her circumstances, had been part of a system. That she'd been testing and refining her approach on him. That he wasn't special. He was just the first one who'd worked well enough that she decided to repeat the process. The shame was immense. It was the shame of a man who'd built his entire identity on being intelligent and in control, suddenly confronted with the evidence of his own blindness. It was the shame of having been willing to be fooled, of having wanted to be fooled in some fundamental way, because being fooled meant someone needed him. And being needed for David had become the primary measure of whether his life meant anything at all. Marcus Williams was the second. He was younger than David, 41, and wealthier. He'd made his money in tech in that peculiar moment when being first to an idea mattered more than being good at execution. He had the particular confidence that comes from having succeeded early and often. He also had something that David lacked. He'd been in therapy. He understood, intellectually, that wealth could create distance. He understood that he might be vulnerable to certain patterns. This understanding, ironically, made him more vulnerable, not less. When Mary presented herself to him, not as someone struggling, but as someone flourishing in unexpected ways, he was drawn to her precisely because she seemed to require less. She had her own apartment. She was working. She had ambitions. What she lacked, and what she presented to him, was not financial support, but emotional validation. She suggested, through careful performance, that she needed him to understand her, to see her, to recognize her potential in a way that the world hadn't yet. This is a different vulnerability than David's, but equally real. Marcus had built his life around being the person who was right, who saw the future first, who recognized potential before it was obvious. Mary positioned herself as potential. She was smart, she said. She was creative. She'd just never had anyone believe in her enough to invest in her ideas. The money, when it came, wasn't framed as rescue. It was framed as investment in her future, as belief in her capacity. The first investment was $10,000 toward a business venture, an online platform for something or other. The details were never entirely clear. And Marcus, caught up in the narrative of being the believer, the one who saw what others missed, didn't ask too many questions. The venture didn't work out, but Mary was grateful. She had tried. The money was gone, but the emotional texture of their relationship had deepened. He'd proven that he believed in her. And belief, she understood, was addictive. What distinguishes Mary's approach with Marcus from her approach with David is the specific vulnerability she exploited. With David, she positioned herself as someone who needed protection. With Marcus, she positioned herself as someone who needed recognition. The softness was different, less fragile, more aspirational, but it was softness nonetheless. It was the softness of someone who was trying so hard to be seen, of someone whose potential was constantly being overlooked, of someone whose brilliance was exactly the kind that needed someone like Marcus to believe in it first. Over 18 months, Mary extracted $185,000 from Marcus. Some of it was framed as business investment. Some of it was framed as help with rent or personal expenses, but presented as temporary solutions while her business got off the ground. The emotional scaffolding was always the same. She needed him to see her, to believe in her, to be the person who finally understood what she was capable of. What's remarkable about Marcus's case is how efficiently Mary calibrated her approach. With David, she'd learned something important. Older men who are lonely often respond to the presentation of fragility, but Marcus wasn't lonely in the same way. He was isolated through success. He needed something different. He needed to be the person who recognized genius before it was obvious. And Mary, understanding this, became a canvas onto which he could project his own vision of foresight. The softness that works on Marcus is subtler than the softness that works on David. It's not the softness of tears or helplessness. It's the softness of someone who is trying so hard to be understood that they're almost fragile from the effort. It's the softness of someone who has believed, until now, that no one would ever see them the way Marcus is beginning to see them. It's the softness of vulnerability in the face of opportunity, rather than vulnerability in the face of desperation. But here's what both David and Marcus, and the two men who would follow, share. They were each willing to interpret Mary's softness as a reflection of who she actually was. They each believed that the version of her they saw was the true version. They each failed to consider that softness might be a strategy, that it might be performed, that it might be refined through repetition. There's a particular cruelty in this recognition. From the perspective of the men who were targeted, the understanding that they weren't chosen because they were special. They were chosen because they were interchangeable, because they fit a profile, because they represented a specific type of vulnerability that Mary had learned to exploit with precision. It's not that she didn't care for them. It's that her caring was secondary to her extraction. It was real, in a way, but it was also instrumental. The care was genuine, but it was directed toward the outcome she needed, rather than toward their actual well-being. What Mary didn't understand, or what she understood but couldn't fully reckon with, is that this kind of targeting creates a specific kind of wound. It's not the same as being robbed by a stranger. It's the wound of having been chosen, specifically for your vulnerabilities, of having been studied and understood for the precise purpose of being exploited. It's the wound of recognizing that the person you cared for you not as an individual, but as a solution to her problem. By the time Mary met Marcus, she'd refined her softness. She knew exactly how much vulnerability to show. She knew when to cry and when to smile. She knew how to position her needs so that they felt like opportunities rather than burdens. She'd learned that wealthy men, despite their success, despite their confidence, were hungry to be needed in very specific ways. And she'd learned to feed that hunger with an exactitude that bordered on scientific. The softness that disarms isn't the softness of weakness. It's the softness of someone who has studied exactly what you need to believe about yourself, and who has then positioned herself as the person who makes that belief possible. It's the softness of understanding, the softness of being seen in return for seeing. It's the softness of someone who makes you feel less alone in a world that has, through success and isolation, become increasingly lonely. This is why Mary was so effective. She didn't present herself as a victim who needed rescue. She presented herself as a possibility that needed nurturing. And nurturing possibilities, for men like David and Marcus, felt good. It felt like generosity. It felt like vision. It felt like love. The third man was James Hartley, a surgeon who had built a life around precision. He was meticulous in his work. He was meticulous in his habits. He was meticulous in his attempts to maintain control over as much of his life as possible. At 47, He'd been divorced twice. He blamed both divorces on the inability of his partners to understand the demands of his career. He did not consider the possibility that his need for control might have made intimacy difficult. He did not consider the possibility that precision in one domain doesn't translate to wisdom in others. When Mary approached him, not with the fragility she'd used on David, not with the aspirational softness she'd used on Marcus, but with an intellectual curiosity that mirrored his own, he was genuinely intrigued. She asked him questions about his work. She listened to his answers. She positioned herself as someone intelligent enough to appreciate his accomplishments, but smart enough not to compete with him. It was a calibrated performance, but it felt authentic to James because it played directly into his fantasy of himself. A brilliant man whose only real problem was finding a partner, sophisticated enough to appreciate him without threatening his autonomy. Within 6 months, Mary had convinced James that she was having financial difficulties that were preventing her from being fully present in their relationship. The specifics were elaborate, a family situation in which she'd been taken advantage of financially, leaving her in debt. A job situation in which she was being underpaid relative to her qualifications. A housing situation in which her landlord was threatening eviction. Each story was detailed enough to be believable. Each story positioned her as smart, but currently trapped by circumstances. It was during this conversation, the conversation in which James agreed to help her, that Mary first suggested a contract. "I want to formalize this," she said. "I don't want you to ever feel like I'm taking advantage of your kindness." She had prepared a document. It was titled Personal Gift Agreement and was written in language that sounded official without being exactly legal. It stated that James was gifting her a sum of money, $25,000 as a gift, freely and without expectation of return. It was binding. It was irrevocable. It was, to anyone actually reading it, a transfer of assets with no strings attached. What's crucial about this moment is that Mary had, by this point, learned something essential. The contract didn't need to protect her legally. It needed to protect the men psychologically. Once they'd signed a document saying the money was a gift, they had locked themselves into that narrative. To later claim they'd been deceived would require them to claim they'd been foolish. And men like James, men who valued control and precision and intelligence, were uniquely resistant to admitting foolishness. James signed the contract without hesitation. He had, after all, created contracts in his personal life before agreements about finances in his previous marriages, prenuptial agreements prepared by lawyers. A contract seemed responsible. It seemed like the kind of thing an intelligent person would insist on. It seemed like a way of ensuring that everyone understood the terms of the arrangement. What James didn't understand is that the contract was the arrangement. The money was incidental. What mattered was that he'd signed something that, if he ever tried to claim he'd been deceived, would make him look like he was lying. A contract that said the money was a gift from him, freely given. A contract that he'd willingly signed while supposedly an adult in full possession of his faculties. Over 2 years, James gave Mary approximately $340,000. Some came from additional gift agreements. Some came as transfers that were verbally agreed upon, but not documented. By the time Mary ended the relationship abruptly and without explanation, which was itself part of the pattern James had constructed an internal narrative in which he'd been the generous one, the intelligent one, the one with the capacity to help. He'd convinced himself that the money was a fair price for the companionship and validation she'd provided. What's interesting about James's case is how completely the contract accomplished what Mary needed. When James eventually discovered the existence of the other men, when the pattern became undeniable, he initially didn't share that information with anyone. He kept it private. He told himself a story about why. He'd violated the contract by trying to claim he'd been deceived. He'd signed something saying the money was a gift. How could he now claim it was extraction? How could he now claim he'd been foolish? The contract was psychological architecture. It was a way of preventing the victim from articulating that he'd been victimized. It was a way of ensuring that the moment of exposure would be met not with anger and action, but with shame and silence. By the time the fourth man was brought into this constellation, By the time there were 4 separate relationships running simultaneously in different cities, each generating revenue, each isolated from the others, Mary had perfected a system. She understood the vulnerabilities of different types of men. She understood how to calibrate her softness for maximum effect. She understood how to use their own intelligence against them. She understood how to construct contracts that were simultaneously generous and extractive, dependent on the signer's willingness to accept the interpretation that benefited him psychologically. What she didn't understand, what she seemed genuinely unable to contemplate, was that her system was fragile, that it depended entirely on isolation, that it required each man to believe that he was the only one, that it was vulnerable to the possibility that one of them might compare notes. The 4th man was Thomas Price. He was 61. He was the wealthiest of the 4, having accumulated his money through family inheritance combined with successful real estate ventures. He was also the loneliest, though he wouldn't have described himself that way. He would have described himself as private, reserved, selective about intimacy. What he actually was, though, was isolated in a way that had become so normalized in his life that he no longer recognized it as isolation. Thomas had been a widower for 7 years. His wife had died after a long illness. The grief had transformed into something he didn't quite know how to name, a resignation perhaps, an acceptance that the major emotional connection of his life had ended and that it was unlikely, at his age, to be replicated. He was not desperate. He was not even particularly lonely, in the acute sense. He was simply closed. A man who had loved and lost and decided, without articulating this decision, that the risk of loving again wasn't worth the pain of losing again. When Mary appeared in his life, introduced through a friend of a friend at a charity event, she was unlike anyone he'd encountered in recent years. She was interested in him, genuinely and specifically, not in his money, or so it seemed, not in his status, simply in him, in his thoughts about his life, in his perspective on things, in the particular wisdom that comes from having lived as long as he had. She presented herself as someone young enough to have a future, but mature enough to appreciate depth. It was a seductive positioning. Over the course of 4 months, Thomas and Mary developed what he understood to be an intimate friendship. Not a romantic relationship exactly. They had not become physically intimate, but something more profound, a meeting of minds. She would visit him. They would talk for hours. She would ask him questions about his past, his marriage, his experience of loss. She would listen with an attention that felt absolute. In those moments, Thomas felt less alone than he had in years. It was during one of these conversations, when they were discussing, somewhat abstractly, the nature of financial security and what it means, that Mary mentioned her situation. She was, she said, trying to build a financial foundation. At her age, with her history, she was acutely aware of how precarious financial security actually was, how quickly circumstances could change, how important it was to have some stability set aside. Thomas, moved by this vulnerability, offered to help. He would set up a trust for her, an investment account, something that would ensure that she had security regardless of what happened. Mary demurred. She didn't want to complicate things. But Thomas insisted, and when he brought up the idea of documenting it, of making a formal agreement, Mary carefully suggested that it be framed as a gift rather than an investment or trust. She wanted to protect him legally, she said. If she ever asked for more, he should have documentation that this was something he'd chosen to give her freely, without obligation. The language was elegant. It made documentation feel like an act of protection for him. And Thomas, who was intelligent and successful and used to making careful decisions, signed without thinking too deeply about what he was signing. He signed because Mary had positioned the contract as his protection. And he signed because, at 61, having recently felt the stirrings of connection for the first time in 7 years, he wanted to make this woman feel secure. He wanted her to know that he was capable of providing for her. He wanted, in short, to believe that his reopened heart was capable of meaningful action. What distinguished Thomas's situation from the others is that he was more isolated from the information about what Mary was doing. David had discovered the truth through a chance encounter. Marcus might have discovered it if Mary's pattern hadn't shifted. But Thomas, living in a different city, connected to Mary primarily through occasional visits and phone calls, had no framework for understanding that she was simultaneously extracting money from 3 other men in a system that was, by this point, operating with mechanical precision. Over 18 months, Thomas gave Mary approximately $520,000. It was, notably, the most of any of the 4. Part of this was because Thomas had the most money. Part of it was because, at his age, with his particular vulnerability to the idea that he might have one final opportunity for meaningful connection, he was willing to give more to secure it. What's psychologically interesting about Thomas's case is that it reveals something true about how much the system depended on the victim's willingness to stay inside the narrative. Mary, at this point, was not particularly careful. She was less present than she had been with the other men. She sometimes forgot details about stories she'd told him. She sometimes seemed distant, preoccupied. But Thomas, so grateful for her presence, so relieved to have someone in his life who made him feel less alone, chose not to notice these inconsistencies. Or, more accurately, he noticed them but interpreted them generously. She was busy. She was stressed. She was dealing with her own complications. His job, from his perspective, was not to interrogate her reality, but to support her through it. This is a crucial aspect of how exploitation works. It doesn't require the victim to be foolish. It requires the victim to want to believe. And people who are lonely, who are isolated, who have experienced lost people like Thomas, are particularly vulnerable to the seduction of being needed. They will interpret almost any behavior as evidence of connection if the alternative is the return to solitude. By the time Mary was managing 4 separate relationships, she had refined the system to its apex. Each man was isolated from the others. Each man received just enough attention to feel special. Each man had signed documents that made it psychologically difficult for him to later claim he'd been deceived. Each man wanted to believe that his relationship with Mary was real, was special, was redemptive in some way. And Mary, understanding this, had created a system in which belief was easier than skepticism. The pattern had begun to take on a momentum of its own. It wasn't even clear at this point whether Mary was making a conscious choice to continue extracting money, or whether the system had simply become her default mode of relating to people with wealth and vulnerability. The line between strategy and psychological compulsion had become blurred. She had optimized her life so completely around extraction that she might no longer have known how to relate to another person without running the algorithm. There is a moment in every system of deception, a moment when the deceiver is alone, away from the performance, away from the carefully constructed narrative, when the truth becomes unavoidable. For Mary, that moment came at 2 a.m. in a hotel room in Seattle. She was lying in bed, unable to sleep, checking her email. A message from Thomas. Something about missing her voice. Something about looking forward to their next trip together. She read it. She felt, in response, absolutely nothing. That absence of feeling was important. It was the moment in which she had to confront something she'd been avoiding for years. The possibility that she didn't actually care about any of them. That the softness she'd performed, the vulnerability she'd constructed, the intimacy she'd feigned, that none of it corresponded to anything real inside her. She had become so skilled at the performance that she'd perhaps lost track of whether there was a self underneath the performance at all. The question she avoided, but which was becoming increasingly unavoidable, was this: if I'm lying to all of them all the time, who am I actually? Is there a version of me that's real, or have I optimized myself into something hollow? She had constructed an answer to this question years ago, when the system first began. The answer was, you're surviving. You're doing what you need to do to ensure that you never go back to the instability of your childhood. You're protecting yourself. The extraction of money from these men wasn't cruelty. It was prudence. It was survival. It was the continuation of a strategy that had worked. But at 2 a.m, that answer wasn't working anymore, because she had enough money now. She had more than enough. She had accumulated, through careful extraction, roughly $1.3 million across various accounts. She had financial security in a way that was absolute, and yet she continued to contact these men, She continued to receive their messages. She continued to extract more. If this was about survival, it should have stopped. But it hadn't, which meant it was about something else. It meant that what had begun as a survival strategy had become, what? An addiction? A compulsion? A way of confirming, again and again, that she had value specifically because someone was willing to give up their resources for her? It meant that the thing she'd been optimizing for financial security was no longer the actual goal. The actual goal had become something more disturbing, the verification that she could make someone want her, that she could make someone choose her, that she could construct a reality in which she was worth something because someone with money had decided she was. In the weeks that followed this recognition, Mary faced something that very few people who have built their lives on deception ever have to face: the collapse of the justifying narrative. She had always told herself that she was the victim in this story, that her childhood poverty, her early instability, her lack of inherited privilege, these things had made her strategic, had made her careful, had made her willing to do things that others wouldn't do. The system she'd built was a rational response to an irrational world that had never given her anything freely. But what happens when the system works? When the poverty ends? When the instability is replaced by absolute financial security? The narrative becomes harder to maintain. And the longer you maintain it anyway, the more you have to confront the possibility that the system was never actually about your survival. It was about something else, something darker, something closer to a need to feel powerful by making someone else powerless, to feel chosen by making someone else choose you, to feel valuable by extracting value from someone who'd already given you everything. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with this recognition. It's not the loneliness that comes from being isolated. It's the loneliness that comes from recognizing that you have isolated yourself, that the performance has gone on so long that you no longer remember what was beneath it, that you have optimized yourself into a shape that is good at extraction and bad at everything else. Mary's response to this recognition was, perhaps predictable. She didn't stop. She didn't confess. She didn't reach out to any of the four men and say, "I've taken money under false pretenses, and I need to return it." Instead, she deepened the system. She became less careful about covering her tracks. She became more efficient about extraction. It was as if, having confronted the hollowness at the center of what she built, she decided to lean further into it rather than away from it. She began to arrange larger loans from Thomas. She suggested a new business opportunity to Marcus. She indicated to David that a family member needed urgent help. The stories became less detailed. The urgency became more apparent. It was as if the performance was winding down, as if she was beginning to operate from a place of desperation rather than strategy. And this is the moment at which the system became fragile, not because Mary had done anything differently, but because she'd stopped caring whether they believed her. And when you stop caring whether someone believes you, when you're simply going through the motions of extraction without the emotional investment that makes deception effective, you become sloppy. You forget which man you told which story. You reference details that don't match. You become, in short, visible in a way you haven't been before. It took Thomas 48 hours to notice the inconsistency. It took him another week to reach out to David. It took all four of them another week to fully understand what had happened. But it started with Mary's collapse into honesty. Not the honesty of confession, but the honesty of not caring anymore whether they believed her. And in that moment, the system that had depended on isolation and belief began to come apart. The question she had avoided, "Who am I actually?" was finally about to be answered, not by her, but by the men she'd deceived, comparing notes, recognizing patterns, understanding finally that they had each been targeted not because they were special, but because they were interchangeable, that they had been chosen for their vulnerabilities, studied for their weaknesses, and exploited for their capacity to rationalize being used. The call came on a Tuesday. David to Marcus. "I need to tell you about someone." What followed was not a dramatic moment of confrontation. What followed was quiet, methodical, painful. A sequence of phone calls across different cities. A sequence of men coming to terms with the fact that they'd been deceived. But more than that, They'd been deceived in exactly the same way. They'd been studied. They'd been targeted. They'd been chosen for the specific vulnerabilities that Mary had learned to exploit. Marcus was the first to feel anger. "She stole from me," he said. "It doesn't matter what I signed. She stole from me." But the thing about having signed a contract that says the money was a gift is that it becomes difficult to claim theft after the fact. It becomes difficult to claim anything other than, "You were foolish. You were alone. You wanted to be needed more than you wanted to be careful." David felt shame. "I should have known," he kept saying. "I should have known." But what exactly should he have known? That the woman he'd cared for was deceiving him? That the emotional intimacy was performance? That the gratitude was calculated? All of these things, perhaps. But also, he wanted to believe that someone needed him. And that desire created a blind spot large enough to hide an entire scheme inside. James felt something more complex than anger or shame. He felt betrayed by his own intelligence. He'd built his life around precision, on the idea that careful thinking could control outcomes. And yet, for all his precision, he'd missed something fundamental. He'd been so careful in his professional life that he'd become careless in his personal life. He'd assumed that the skills that made him successful in one domain would translate to others. And they hadn't. They'd actually made him more vulnerable, because precision creates confidence. And confidence creates blindness. Thomas felt primarily old. He felt like a man who'd thought he had one more opportunity for connection, and that opportunity had been an illusion. He felt like someone who'd paid an enormous amount of money for the illusion of mattering. And he felt the particular pain that comes from recognizing that his desire for connection had overridden his capacity for skepticism, that he would have believed almost anything if it meant not going back to the solitude that had defined his life since his wife died. What happened next was a series of conversations between the men, not all at once, not in a unified way, but gradually, over weeks, they came together. They shared what Mary had told each of them. They recognized the patterns. They realized that what had felt like unique, intimate connections were actually performances of a script that had been refined through repetition. The recognition was devastating because it revealed something true about their own vulnerability. They had each wanted to believe. They had each had something missing: loneliness, doubt, the need to feel essential. And Mary had exploited that missing thing with precision. She'd created a version of herself that was exactly calibrated to fill the void they each carried. And in doing so, she'd revealed how much they needed that void to be filled, how desperately they wanted to believe that someone understood them. The question of what to do about it was complicated. Mary had broken no laws. Technically, the money had been gifted. The contracts were real. They had signed them. What she'd done was psychological manipulation, but psychological manipulation is not a crime. What she'd done was create false narratives to extract money, but false narratives are not prosecutable if the money was given willingly. The only leverage they had was the threat of exposure. If they went public with the story, they would damage Mary's ability to continue the scheme. But going public with the story also meant making public their own foolishness. It meant admitting that they'd been targeted, that they'd been chosen for their vulnerabilities, that the thing they'd wanted to believe about themselves, that they were intelligent, careful, able to avoid being deceived, was false. 3 of the 4 decided to stay silent. They absorbed the loss. They told themselves stories about what had happened that positioned them more generously than the truth would allow. They moved on, but David decided to speak, not publicly, not to the authorities, but to the other men and to the people in his life who mattered. He decided to acknowledge his foolishness, not in the form of confession, but in the form of explanation. He'd been lonely. He'd wanted to feel needed. He'd encountered someone who understood that need and exploited it. These things were true simultaneously. Mary had deceived him, and he had made himself vulnerable to deception. He had not forced himself to see what was true, because seeing what was true would have required giving up the story he'd constructed about himself. In telling the truth about what happened, David was able to do something the other men couldn't. He was able to stop blaming Mary and start understanding himself. Not in a way that was self-pitying or redemptive, but in a way that was honest. He had wanted to be the rescuer. He had wanted to matter. He had wanted to believe that his wealth could be translated into meaning. And Mary, understanding this, had given him the opportunity to believe these things. The fact that she'd done it as a strategy didn't make the desire any less real. The conversations between the four men became, over time, something unexpected, a kind of group therapy, not formal, not with a therapist, but a shared reckoning with what they'd wanted to believe about themselves, and how that wanting had made them vulnerable. They talked about the specific ways that success had isolated them, the way that money created distance from normal human struggle, the way that isolation had made them vulnerable to someone who could make them feel less alone. What emerged was not a unified narrative about Mary. It was four separate narratives, each one true, but none of them complete. Because the complete narrative would have required Mary's perspective, and Mary was not offering it. Mary, far apart, had gone quiet. Once the exposure began David reached out to the other men. Once the pattern became undeniable, she stopped responding to messages. She deleted her social media. She made herself unavailable. When the men eventually tried to make contact, there was no one on the other end of the line. Just an emptiness. Just the recognition that the person they'd known was, and had always been, a construction. That the self they'd connected with was a fiction. This is what it looks like when the system collapses. Not with drama, but with silence. Not with confrontation, but with absence. The person at the center of the deception simply ceases to exist, leaves no forwarding address, offers no explanation. The victim is left to construct meaning out of emptiness. We end where we began, with a contract, with documents signed in blue ink, with language that seemed to protect the person who signed them, while actually ensuring that they could never claim to have been deceived. This is the mechanism that allowed Mary Martin to extract over $1.3 million from four separate men without technically breaking any laws. Not through threat, not through force, through the careful construction of documents that made every transfer a gift, every extraction a choice, every lie a consequence of their own willingness to believe. The story of Mary Martin is not, fundamentally, a story about a woman who discovered how to exploit rich men. It's a story about what happens to people when they become so focused on financial security that they lose the ability to connect authentically with other human beings. It's a story about what happens to systems when they incentivize isolation. It's a story about what happens when we optimize ourselves so completely for one goal that we become unable to recognize ourselves anymore. For Mary, the optimization was total. She had taken the vulnerability that came from childhood poverty, the understanding that safety was conditional, that love was work, that dependency was shameful, and she'd turned it into a system that was, by any measure, successful. She had money. She had freedom. She had eliminated the scarcity that had defined her early life. But in doing so, she had also eliminated something else, the possibility of genuine connection, the possibility of being known, the possibility of mattering to someone for reasons other than the resources she could extract from them. The question that lingers, after the exposure, after the silence, after the moment when all four men understood what had been done to them, is this: in a world that tells us that financial security is the ultimate good, that money is the measure of worth, that isolation is the price of success in such a world, what is the difference between Mary's system and the systems that the rest of us operate inside? She targeted vulnerable men and exploited their need to feel essential. But society targets vulnerable people and exploits their need for financial security every day. She created false intimacy in order to extract resources. But institutions create false belonging in order to extract labor. She made herself invaluable by demonstrating that the men needed her. But systems make themselves invaluable by demonstrating that we need them. This is not an excuse for what Mary did. It is an observation about what her actions reveal about the psychology of deception and need in a world where intimacy is scarce and financial insecurity is endemic. It is a recognition that Mary didn't invent the vulnerability she exploited. She simply understood it and weaponized it. And the men she targeted didn't create the loneliness they experienced. Society created it by structuring success in a way that eliminated the very connections that might make success meaningful. For David, James, Marcus, and Thomas, the aftermath was complicated. They had lost money, certainly, but they had also lost something harder to quantify: the belief that their judgment was reliable, the confidence that they could understand other people, the hope that they might, at their age, find meaningful connection. These losses are not recoverable through legal action. They are not recoverable through exposure. They are only recoverable, if they are recoverable at all, through the slow and painful process of recognizing that vulnerability is not weakness, that being deceived is not evidence of foolishness, that wanting to be needed is a deeply human desire that does not make you stupid for acting on it. What the contract reveals, ultimately, is the mechanism by which people rationalize their own exploitation. Once you've signed a document saying that money was a gift, you've locked yourself into a narrative that prevents you from later claiming you were deceived. You've created a situation in which speaking the truth about what happened requires you to admit to foolishness. And human beings, when faced with that choice, will often choose silence, will often choose to absorb the loss rather than expose themselves to shame. This is the deeper mechanism of Mary's system, not the deception itself, but the way in which the deception was documented, the way in which she ensured that the moment of exposure would be met with silence rather than action, the way in which she understood that shame is a more powerful silencer than fear, that a man who has signed a contract giving away his money will protect that contract more fiercely than the woman who manipulated him into signing it. We don't know what happened to Mary after the silence. There are fragments, a report of her in Portland, where she grew up, a suggestion that she may have started over, a possibility that she's running the same system in a different geography. The truth is that once someone becomes invisible, we lose the ability to track them. We lose the ability to know whether the exposure changed them, whether it formed them, or whether it simply taught them to be more careful. What we do know is what her story reveals about the rest of us, about how isolation creates vulnerability, about how the pursuit of financial security can transform us into people incapable of genuine connection, about how the documents we sign, the narratives we construct about ourselves, the stories we tell to justify why we've made the choices we've made, about how these things can become more real to us than the actual truth of our lives. The central question of this story, the question that Mary herself could not answer, is this: is there a self beneath the performance? Or do we become, through repeated deception of others or ourselves, the performance itself? And if we do become the performance, if we optimize ourselves so completely that there's nothing left but the algorithm, what does that mean for the possibility of redemption, for the possibility of change, for the possibility of ever being genuinely known by another person? These are the questions that the contract cannot answer. They are the questions that remain, suspended in the space between what happened and what it means. They are the questions that each of the four men, separately and differently, has had to reckon with. And they are the questions that anyone who has been deceived, or who has deceived, or who has simply lived inside a narrative so long that they've forgotten where the story ends and they begin, they are the questions that all of us must eventually face. The contract was, in the end, not a legal document. It was a psychological one. It was a way of saying, I understand that you need to believe a certain story about yourself. I understand that you need to feel like you made a choice. I understand that you will protect the narrative you've constructed more fiercely than you will protect yourself. And I'm going to use that understanding to ensure that when the truth emerges, you will choose silence over acknowledgement, shame over action, the preservation of your image over the pursuit of justice. This is what the contract reveals, not about Mary, but about all of us.